All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. We've got some fascinating stuff to dig into today. We always appreciate you sending in those resources. And this time, the focus seems to be on multimedia learning.
Yeah, definitely lots of interesting stuff coming in.
Really makes you think about how we learn best from things like videos and animations and all that good stuff.
Absolutely. And one of the ideas that really jumped out from what you sent was this concept of the segmenting effect.
Yeah, the segmenting effect. That seems to be a pretty key concept from what I was reading too. So for anyone who's not familiar with that term, maybe we can just start with a quick definition.
Sure. So the basic idea is this. When you break down multimedia learning materials into smaller pieces, like shorter segments or chunks, people tend to learn more effectively.
Makes sense. Instead of just one long, continuous stream of information, you get those built-in pauses.
Right. Those pauses can give you a chance to kind of process what you just saw or heard, maybe make connections to what you already know.
Yeah, and I noticed that a lot of the research you sent mentioned that these smaller chunks often come with learner control. So not only is the information broken down, but you also get to decide when you're ready to move on to the next segment.
Exactly. That learner control aspect seems to be a big part of why segmenting is so effective. You get to learn at your own pace, pause when you need to, rewind if something wasn't clear.
And you sent over this really comprehensive meta-analysis. I mean, this thing was impressive. It looked at a ton of different studies on the segmenting effect.
Yeah, that meta-analysis is a great resource because it pulls together findings from, like you said, a whole bunch of individual studies so we can get a much clearer picture of the overall impact of segmenting rather than just relying on one or two studies.
Perfect. So for this deep dive, let's really try to break down what this meta-analysis, along with your other sources, tells us about the segmenting effect.
Sounds good.
We'll explore when it works best, why it seems to help us learn better, and how we can use this knowledge to get the most out of any kind of multimedia learning we're doing.
Okay, so maybe we should start by just diving into some of the key results from that meta-analysis. I mean, this thing analyzed data from 56 different studies, which included 88 comparisons.
Wow, that is a lot of data to work with. So what do they find?
Well, the big takeaway is that they found a significant segmenting effect. It wasn't just a small, barely noticeable difference either. They saw small to medium improvements in both how well people remembered the information.
So better retention.
Exactly. And also in how well they could apply what they learned to new situations. That's what we call transfer.
Okay, so not only are we understanding the information better when it's segmented, we're also more likely to actually be able to use it in real-world scenarios.
Right. And what's really interesting is that they found these improvements in both retention and transfer, even when the learning system itself controlled the pacing of the segments. So it's not just about you clicking a next button. The very act of breaking the information into chunks seems to have some kind of inherent benefit.
So even if you don't have that learner control, just the fact that the material is presented in segments rather than one long stream seems to make a difference.
It does seem that way. Now, on top of the benefits to retention and transfer, the meta-analysis also found something pretty remarkable about how people perceived the learning experience.
What was that?
Well, they found that segmentation actually led to a reduction in what's called cognitive load. Essentially, people felt like they were putting in less mental effort when the information was segmented.
So it actually felt easier to learn.
Exactly. But here's the catch. Even though it felt easier, people actually spent more time engaged with the material when it was broken down into segments.
That's fascinating. It's like we're tricking our brains into learning more by making it feel less demanding.
It really is. Now, obviously, the big question is, why does this happen? Why does breaking information down have such a positive impact on how we learn? And luckily, the researchers have some pretty solid theories about what might be going on.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the first theory they propose?
All right. So the first explanation has to do with what's called chunking and structure. Basically, when instructional designers thoughtfully divide up the multimedia content into logical, well-defined segments, it helps our brains organize that information much more effectively.
I can see that. It's like taking a big, complex task and breaking it down into smaller and more manageable steps.
Precisely. Our brains are much better at handling smaller pieces of information, and when those pieces are organized in a logical way, it becomes much easier for us to make sense of the bigger picture.
So in a way, segmenting helps us to create a kind of mental roadmap for the information.
Exactly. Now, in the context of segmenting, there's this term that comes up called temporal cueing. Have you come across that?
I have seen that term. But to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it means. Can you explain it?
Sure. So imagine you're watching a video lesson, and the instructor has just finished explaining a concept. Right before they move on to the next idea, there's a brief pause. That pause acts as a kind of signal to your brain, like a little ding, saying, okay, we're shifting gears now. Time to file away what we just learned and get ready for something new.
Ah, I get it. So those pauses between segments act as these temporal cues, helping us to mentally separate different ideas or steps.
Exactly. It's like adding punctuation to a sentence. It just makes everything flow better and easier to understand.
And this idea of temporal cueing ties into something else I read about called segmentation theory.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating one.
It suggests that our brains naturally perceive actions and events as these distinct separate units.
Right, like our brains are constantly trying to break down the flow of experience into manageable chunks. And when we present information in a way that aligns with that natural tendency, it just feels more intuitive and easier to process.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got the chunking and structure theory. What's the second explanation for why segmenting works so well?
The second idea focuses on the additional processing time that segmenting can provide. This is especially true when the learner has control over the pacing.
Right, when you have that continue button and you can decide when you're ready to move on.
Exactly. That moment of pause, that control over when you move to the next segment, allows you to really process what you've just learned. You can think about it, connect it to your existing knowledge, maybe even rehearse it in your mind.
I've definitely experienced that. Sometimes when I'm watching a video or listening to a lecture and the information is just coming at me nonstop, I start to feel overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's like your brain is trying to drink from a fire hose.
Right, and you end up missing things or just not fully grasping the concepts.
Exactly. That's because we have limited working memory. It's like a mental workspace where we hold and manipulate information. And when that workspace gets overloaded, things start to fall apart.
Segmenting prevents that overload by giving us those crucial breaks to catch our breath and consolidate what we've just learned before moving on.
Right. And, these pauses can also be really helpful in dealing with what are called split attention effects. Have you ever noticed how, like, if you're trying to follow a recipe video and they're demonstrating some technique, but the list of ingredients is off to the side in tiny text?
Oh yeah, it's impossible.
Your attention is having to jump back and forth between those different sources of information, and that can really disrupt your learning.
Totally. Okay, so segmenting gives us those breaks to process, to reduce cognitive load, and to avoid those split attention effects. What's the third theory?
Okay, so the third idea really gets at the heart of why that learner control aspect of segmenting is so powerful.
The continue button.
Exactly. Being able to decide when you move to the next segment lets you tailor the learning experience to your own individual needs and learning style. Some people might need more time to process certain concepts, while others can move through things more quickly.
Right, we all learn at different paces. And having that control over the pacing allows you to really personalize the learning experience.
And there's a big psychological benefit to that sense of control as well. It can make you feel more engaged, more motivated, and less anxious about the learning process.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, so we've covered the three main theories for why segmenting works: chunking and structure, additional processing time, and learner control.
Right. Now, another really interesting question that the meta-analysis looked at was how someone's prior knowledge of the subject matter might influence how much they benefit from segmenting.
Interesting. My initial thought would be that maybe someone who's brand new to a topic would benefit more from the structure and organization that segmenting provides.
That's a very logical assumption. You might think that someone who already knows a bit about the subject wouldn't need those smaller chunks or those pauses.
Right. They might even find it a bit tedious or disruptive to their flow.
And there is a well-established concept in learning science called the expertise reversal effect, which suggests that sometimes giving too much guidance or structure can actually hinder those who are already knowledgeable in a domain.
But what did the meta-analysis actually find?
So what they found specifically in relation to remembering information was that learners with higher prior knowledge actually showed more improvement in retention when the material was segmented compared to those with lower prior knowledge.
Wow, that is kind of counterintuitive.
It is, and the researchers offered a couple of possible explanations for this. One idea is that maybe the learners who were classified as having high prior knowledge in these studies hadn't actually reached the level of deep expertise where that reversal effect really kicks in.
Okay, so maybe they weren't quite expert enough for the extra structure to become a hindrance.
Right. The other possibility is that those with some existing knowledge might be better equipped to leverage the segmented structure to their advantage.
So they're better at using those pauses and those smaller chunks to make connections and to integrate the new information with what they already know.
Exactly. They might be more efficient at knowing what to focus on and how to make the most of each segment.
That's a really interesting nuance. So while segmenting seems to be generally beneficial for everyone, those with some foundation in the subject might see an even bigger boost in how well they retain the information.
It seems that way. Now, one more thing to note about prior knowledge is that it didn't seem to have a significant impact on how segmenting affected transfer performance.
So regardless of prior knowledge, segmenting generally helps people apply what they've learned to new situations.
Exactly. Now, the meta-analysis also explored whether having even more control over the learning experience beyond just controlling the pace might impact the effectiveness of the segmenting effect.
Okay, like being able to repeat sections or to choose the order in which you go through the segments.
Exactly. For example, let's say you have the option to replay the entire multimedia instruction as many times as you want. Does that diminish the need for the material to be segmented in the first place?
Yeah, that's something I've often wondered about. If I can just rewind and rewatch a section, do I really need the content broken down into segments?
Well, what the researchers found was that simply having that option to repeat the whole thing didn't significantly change how much people benefited from the initial segmentation.
So it seems that the strategic breaking down of the information at those key points to avoid overload still has a unique advantage, regardless of whether you have a replay button.
Right. It's like, having chapters in a book. Even if you can go back and reread the whole book, the chapter breaks still serve a purpose. They help you organize the information in your mind as you're reading.
That's a great analogy. Okay, what about controlling the order of the segments? Some learners might prefer to jump around or focus on specific areas that are more relevant to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. But interestingly enough, the meta-analysis found that being able to manipulate the sequence of segments didn't actually make a significant difference in terms of the overall segmenting effect.
So even with that added flexibility, the benefits of segmenting remain pretty consistent.
Right. And one possible explanation for this is that without clear guidance on how best to navigate the information, learners might not make optimal use of that freedom to reorder the segments.
So even if you have the option to jump around, you might still end up following a more linear path, especially if you're not familiar with the material.
Exactly. It's like having a choose-your-own-adventure book, but without a map. You might end up feeling a bit lost and unsure of where to go next.
So it seems that the well-designed segmentation itself provides a kind of structure that can be really helpful for learners, even if they have the option to deviate from it.
Absolutely. And this actually leads us to a really important distinction that the meta-analysis highlights. The difference between what's called system-paced segmentation and learner-paced segmentation.
Okay, we touched on this briefly before, but let's dive a little deeper. Remind us again, what's the difference between those two approaches?
Sure. So in system-paced segmentation, the learning system, whether it's a software program or an online platform, controls when the segments advance.
So you're essentially passively watching or listening, and the system automatically moves you to the next segment after a predetermined amount of time.
Right. It's kind of like watching a slideshow presentation where the slides advance automatically at set intervals. Now, in learner-paced segmentation, you, the learner, have to actively do something to move to the next part, like clicking a button or pressing a key.
Okay, so you have control over the pacing. And what did the meta-analysis find in terms of the effectiveness of these two approaches?
Well, they found that system-paced segmentation actually led to significant improvements in all three areas: retention, transfer, and cognitive load.
So even though you're not actively controlling the pace, just having those built-in breaks where the system automatically pauses the content seems to provide substantial benefits across the board.
Exactly. It's like the system is doing the chunking and structuring for you, and your brain can just relax and focus on processing the information.
That's amazing. So even if you don't have the option for learner control, just having a well-designed system-paced presentation can make a real difference.
Absolutely. Now, learner-paced segmentation, on the other hand, showed a particularly strong benefit for transfer performance.
So the ability to apply the knowledge to new situations.
Right, but the effects on retention and cognitive load weren't quite as clear in the meta-analysis. This suggests that the act of actively engaging with the pacing, making those conscious decisions about when you're ready to move on, might be especially important for developing a deeper understanding that can be transferred to different contexts.
It's like that active engagement forces you to really think about the material and to make those connections.
Precisely. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's try to pull out some of the key takeaways for our listeners. What are the big things people should keep in mind about the segmenting effect?
Okay, so first and foremost, the research overwhelmingly suggests that breaking down multimedia learning into smaller, logical segments is generally a good thing. It helps us understand the information better, remember it better, and even apply it better.
I agree. And don't underestimate the power of structure, even if it's not self-paced. System-paced segmentation with those built-in pauses can be really effective in reducing cognitive overload and enhancing learning.
Absolutely. But also recognize the value of being able to control your own learning pace when possible, especially if you're aiming for deeper understanding and application. That active engagement seems to be key.
And remember the interesting finding about prior knowledge. If you already have some foundation in the subject matter, you might see an even bigger boost in retention when learning is segmented.
That's a good point. And finally, it's worth noting that simply having the option to repeat the entire instruction or to jump around between segments doesn't seem to negate the benefits of well-designed segmentation. The strategic breaking down of information into manageable chunks seems to offer its own unique advantages.
Absolutely. So, as you go about your own learning journeys, here's something to think about. How can you apply this principle of segmenting, even if the materials you're working with aren't explicitly designed that way?
Yeah, it's a great question to ask.
Like if you're reading a long article or watching a dense lecture, could you pause at certain points to summarize what you've just learned or to jot down some key takeaways? Could you mentally break down the information into smaller chunks to make it more digestible?
It really highlights the importance of active processing and finding ways to structure information in a way that aligns with how our brains work best.
Exactly. So keep exploring those learning strategies, and we hope this deep dive into the segmenting effect has given you some valuable insights to help you learn more effectively.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. See you next time.